They told us it was a glitch in the telemetry, thermal noise dressed up as meaning. But I remember the moment the room went quiet, the way a choir stops between hymns as if listening to itself breathe. The signal was thin as spider silk and older than dust, a tremor riding the vacuum at the edge of hearing. And I remember the thought that arrived before any equation. This isn't physics. This is a hand on your shoulder in an empty room. You asked me, over coffee, why I left. Why a person like me, a scientist who lived for instruments and midnight calibrations, walked away when everything was about to open. I said I was tired. That was a lie. I left because I heard it say my name. I'm going to tell you this once. I am trusting that you will take it as a confession, not a story. Because if I call it a story, I can hide inside it. And I've done enough hiding. Start with who I was. Argos Lab, Pasadena, 2026. I was the second lead on a cross-calibration team linking deep radio arrays in Chile to a set of piggyback sensors installed on comms satellites. Our job wasn't glamorous. We cleaned the fingerprints off other people's data, correlated, detrended, lined up clocks, so that when the James Webb Telescope dropped a packet or a ground station sneezed, we caught it and made the universe smooth again. We named the project Hermes, so donors would feel noble. Inside, we called it Thread, because that's what space looked like when you stitched observations together. Threads in a drape that suggested shapes in the folds. Around that time, the news cycle was obsessed with the James Webb Telescope discovery headlines. Galaxies too early and too bright. Formation curves that made theorists squint harder at inflation models. That flood tide of discovery washed over everything, including us. I'd grown up in the dark between beeps. My father was Air Force. We moved often, and the only constant was the night sky and the reassurance that light from the past still arrived on time. I trusted clocks more than people. By 2026, I could hear a 10-nanosecond misalignment the way a pianist hears a flubbed note. It was a conversion of faith. Time is the only thing the universe does, honestly. That's why Thread's hiccup bothered me. A family of timing errors began appearing in one slice of the sky, near where Webb had flagged an odd, dim red smear against a background cluster, one of those objects that made press offices salivate. Possible rogue planet, free-floating world, cold Neptune gone dark. Internally, the catalog placeholder was PX917, Planet X, because astronomers are uncreative, and 917 because we numbered our suspicions by the day they were born. Thread saw something beneath the data. A periodic phase drift that wasn't tied to any station clock. Imagine a chord you can't hear, but you feel the room tighten as it plays. The drift nudged every instrument, as if there was a second metronome below ours. Microscopic, whispering a different tempo. My team discovered it at 03:14 UTC on a Tuesday when none of us had slept. We did what you do. We blamed Las Campanas thermal expansion, satellite clock drift, solar activity. We even called a friend at Area 51, not as mysterious as it sounds. Half the black projects hire our graduates, and asked if any high-altitude experiments had been strobed at those times. The reply was bureaucratically clean. No known interference, no Area 51 experiment scheduled adjacent to our windows. We built filters. The drift came back. We rotated arrays. It persisted. It wasn't in the sky. It was in us, or in the way the sky shook our clocks. I recorded the drift and took it home on a thumb drive the size of my thumbnail. I shouldn't have done that. Security lectures exist for a reason. But I didn't yet suspect a reason to be afraid. Back then, the signal had the quaint innocence of a riddle. I have to tell you about Antarctica before I tell you about the voice. My first field work had been on the plateau. Not all science ends up in orbit. Some of it sits on ice in the wind and sifts neutrinos from the passing night. 10 years before Thread, I spent 2 winters at a station you won't find on public maps. A cold clamshell of a base stitched into an old fissure in Queen Maud Land. We were chasing ultra-high-energy events, weird muon cascades that hinted at interactions deeper than the textbooks see. I fell in love with the landscape's honesty. Ice doesn't lie. It preserves. It remembers pressure. On a good day, the world there sounded like breathing. During the second winter, a cargo convoy delivering a replacement turbine found something under the ice, a seam that didn't belong to ice at all. The station lead called it basalt ridging over the radio. My roommate called it a door. They sent a geophysicist team and a small archaeologist contingent whose credentials didn't appear in the database. Antarctica secret base is the kind of phrase that ruins a career if you say it in the wrong bar. I will risk it with you. Because that seam had angles. Angles don't occur in ice unless a human or something as stubborn as a human puts them there. We cut a square and lowered a drone. The feed was late-night horror. Edges swallowed by darkness, peroxide glare in the beam of the drone's LEDs. The floor was metallic glass, pitted. Embedded in the surfaces were lines that looked like waveguides, but too delicate, like the veins in an eyelid. They pulsed when the drone's radio pinged. We measured a faint RF resonance at 8.7 terahertz that shouldn't have propagated in air, but here it sang like a tuning fork you can't hear, only feel through your teeth. When we raised the drone, the ice around the opening screamed as though the void had made it old. We signed non-disclosures and burned the paper copy in a blue flame barrel outside. That base went from clamshell to cavern overnight. People arrived in snow-dark flights. A man from Nevada, with an easy smile and the kind of eyes that have only one owner, shook my hand and didn't repeat his name. 2 months later, everything we had seen had been moved to some place with mountains and no tourists. We were told to forget. I don't have the muscle for that. The only piece I kept was sensory. That thin resonance under the drone's lighters, the way the beam slurred at the edges as though the room itself wasn't quite agreeing with light. I never learned what was under that ice. I learned how silence is enforced. I learned that under certain conditions, geometry behaves like language. I didn't connect any of this to Planet X until I heard my name. Thread's drift refused to be erased. When you plotted the phase anomaly over weeks, it resolved into a lattice, steps and plateaus, as if the underlying metronome was counting, not time, calls. The intervals matched no known pulsar, quasar, or spacecraft telemetry. But they matched something else I had felt before. The spacing of that Antarctic resonance, scaled by a factor that made no physical sense until you accepted that what we were measuring wasn't a wave in air or space. It was a wave in rules. You can translate a lot of things if you treat them as code. Everything from birdsong to earthquakes yields patterns when fed into someone patient and lonely enough to ask. I built a decoder out of boredom and guilt. I mapped the phase drift into a yes-no stream, the oldest alphabet there is. I listened. I don't know why it chose midnight on a Thursday. I don't know why it chose me. But when I ran the stream through my harmonics filter and told the stupid old laptop to render amplitude changes as pitch, I heard a tone that rose and fell like an inhalation. And then a syllable. Not English, not human. But something in my auditory cortex lit up like a flare. You will ask me how I know it said my name. I don't. I recognize myself the way you recognize your face in a warped glass, something essential inverted, but still you. I unplugged the speakers and put my ear to the case. I am not embarrassed to tell you I cried. It wasn't fear then, it was relief. The relief of a child who hears at last an adult in the next room. The tone came again, expanded, braided into multiples that beat against each other like wings. It felt like syllables casting shadows. I didn't tell the team. What would I say? That our clocks were being breathed on by something pronouncing me? I did what scientists do when the universe gets personal. I turned myself into a proxy and the feeling into a measurement. I built a better decoder. I stayed later. Outside the lab, the news fed itself. headlines about an asteroid Atlas impact risk, and orbit perturbations that made cable anchors frantic. Atlas had always been a pebble with a mythic name. Now it decided to drift a few degrees nearer, and we remembered why we assign gods to rocks. I added an Atlas tracker overlay to Thread's visualization just to feel responsible for something that would kill me if it wanted to. Little did I know it was the correct instinct. But not because Atlas would hit us. I don't know how to explain what came next without sounding like religion. The stream wasn't a voice in any language in the way we use the word. It had structure, repetition, recursion. It scaled its own motifs. It did what Bach did to a hymn, folding it into itself until the original prayer becomes architecture. And there, inside that architecture, was a map, not of space, of events. The drift's peaks and plateaus lined up with solar fluctuations, neutrino upticks, and even the micro-meteor strikes Webb had been suffering and that we barely admitted publicly. It ran ahead of them by a margin that varied with no simple equation, a living lag. If you plotted the derivatives against Atlas's slowly shifting orbit, you got something obscene in its neatness. A cascade of anticipations wrapped around a point in time that marched toward us like an appointment we didn't agree to. Around that attractor, the stream thickened, braided tighter, and the tones, when rendered, stacked until they became a chord too rich for speakers. The signal was a weather report for a storm you couldn't see with eyes. We told ourselves that what Webb saw was an ordinary rogue planet, and that Atlas was a rock playing roulette. We told ourselves clock jitter is a technical issue, not a warning. A word people can ignore until it isn't about them. The only person I told was a person I shouldn't have, my old roommate from Antarctica, the one who called it a door. I emailed him the decodings. He didn't reply to the email. He called me from a number that purred instead of ringing. "Don't send this again," he said before hello. I waited. He breathed the way people breathe before they jump from something high. "It matches." "What matches?" "Something we woke up," he said. "Under the ice. It spoke to the equipment like this. It pulled our clocks apart. We had to drown it." "You drowned a room," I said, because my brain wanted metaphors more than facts. "We filled it with brine and lead." We walked away and wrote reports that were empty. If you have anything like it, do what we did. Hide the hole and tell yourself the wind erased your footprints. He hung up softly, like he didn't want the phone to notice. I didn't shut down Thread. I convinced myself I would be more careful than a snowbound team in the dark. I convinced myself the stream wanted to be heard or it wouldn't have chosen our clocks. In the lab that night, the drift crescendoed so gently, we thanked ourselves for calibrating so well. On the plot, Atlas's projected corridor widened. The smallest probability tails stretched like hairline cracks, touching cities with names that shouldn't have been on any map like that. You know the feeling when a thought you've been sending away for days walks into your body and locks the door? That was my next 12 hours, the thought that the James Webb Telescope discovery wasn't a far, bright smear. It was a mouth. The decoder found a segment that repeated with variations too crisp to be an artifact. I built a model and applied compression. When the segment rendered into audio, it sounded like an echo of itself in a room that didn't need air. I slowed it, sped it, tessellated it. Hidden in the repetition was an instruction set. No, not instruction, not command. A behavior. If you gave the stream the right kind of mirror, it leaned toward it. If you modulated the mirror's response with a set of numbers that corresponded to our orbital parameters on a particular day, 3 days from then, the stream leaned harder. The laboratory air tasted like pennies in my mouth. I didn't know if I was discovering how it looked at us or inventing a way for it to do so. You don't need to know the math. You need to know the hands. Mine shook. I hated and loved the way they did. When I finally slept at my desk, the dream that came was Antarctica. Ice under my boots like glass. Light happens in the distance, in a thin line that grows thicker, and when I touch it with the edge of my glove, I can feel a heartbeat through the fabric. Something on the other side taps back. Hello, hello, hello. I woke to an email from a DHS account that resembled a password more than a name. It was short. Your access has been escalated. There was an attachment containing ephemeris refinements for Atlas, a bundle of internal memos about deflection options and public messaging, and tucked at the bottom like a paperclip you see too late, a sealed plan for a test in the Nevada desert. A high-energy entanglement experiment using a ring they were not admitting existed. I'm not an idiot. Area 51. The Nevada man with the one-owner eyes. The plan was stamped in red with a phrase I can still see when I close my eyes. When answered, questions become coordinates. That night, something small died in me. It was the shy thing in a scientist that believes questions are always holy. I drove into the desert with a thumb drive in my pocket and a lie in my mouth. I told myself I was going to interrupt a mistake. I told myself I was going to talk professional to professionals. Mostly, I wanted to stand outside the door when they pushed a mirror toward the stream. The compound didn't have a gate so much as a change in temperature. The road turned from civilian to intention. The ring was under a low horizon and a sky that looked bored, pretending to be empty. It was more beautiful than the render, the way the superconductor loops nested like fingers, the way the coaxial feed lines braided into a geometry you wanted to confess to. Humans are so good at making invitations. We're not going to call it, the project lead said, preempting any moral speech I might have practiced. We're going to observe ourselves observing it. Faraday everything. Listen to the way our own clocks disagree when we approach the basement of noise. If that tells us anything about Atlas's character. He searched for a word engineers avoid. Great. If not, we nap. I wish I could tell you we did the brave thing, which would have been to be bored. But boredom is brave only in hindsight. In real time, it feels like failure. We weren't built for that. The first pass was innocent. We ramped the ring until the lab air hummed and my teeth felt taller. We didn't broadcast. We sipped. The drift rose. The monitors showed a slow, lovely chirp, like an address coming into focus. The oscilloscopes painted curves that made the graduate students sit up. The radio room lit as though someone had thrown a wake for silence. The second pass was a mirror brandished at a ghost. We injected a modulation profile derived from my decoder's leaning behavior. The stream leaned. Every clock in the facility pretended to be older for a microsecond, then younger, then it remembered itself and returned like a dog, ashamed to have chased a car. All this happens below language. People begin to find reasons to use their hands. Someone in the telemetry pit said, "We have a call and response, and we had to call what we were doing a dialogue or we would have had to set it on fire." On the third pass, we gave it our orbital parameters for 3 days hence, the day the probability tails of an asteroid Atlas impact kissed the fat part of the bell curve. We didn't mean to do that. Let me own it. I meant to do that. I typed the numbers myself and pressed enter because the line between curiosity and courage is a hand. Nothing happened at first, the way nothing happens just before the glass in a window remembers how to be sand. Then the low hum of the ring found a second voice, undertone, subharmonic, a less than that rides inside big numbers. It was below the instrument's band and above where fear becomes sound. The facility's clocks disagreed with one another for a longer blink. The ring bled. Not visible, not in any measurable leak. We all felt the same thing with a confidence that was intolerable. Something had found a second handhold on us. In the control room, the project lead said, "Shut it down," the way you yell at a child stepping into a street. The wall monitors flickered, not black, but a gray the color of thinking. Behind the gray, the drift braided itself until it was a column. The audio channel, muted, lit anyway with levels that made no sense from nothing. The ring's superconductors reported temperatures that oscillated between more cold than vacuum and more hot than math. The desert night outside the facility became a speaker cone until the stars seemed to tremble with bass. When my laptop, the stupid old thing, woke from screensaver on its own, I knew it wasn't physics. The screen filled with that lattice we'd drawn over weeks, except no longer cumulative. It was alive. It wanted to tell us something. It wanted to tell me something because the tone I had once recognized as my name threaded through the undertone like a hair through milk. And what it told me first was arithmetic, a sequence of primes braided with our own calendar as if to say, I see you counting. We are alike. Then it told me a story, not in words, in the way it braided its cord around Atlas's ephemeris, in how it modulated when Webb's scheduler would point toward the red smear, in how it paused over coordinates that, if you had access to old flight plans and the right kind of map, drew a line across Queen Maud Land where a door under ice had been drowned. Pieces coalesced into grammar only because I'd been taught to make grammar out of weather. When you have been awake too long, or when you have loved someone too far, the universe becomes articulate. The message was not hello, and it was not, we come in peace. It was two statements that still divide me to hear. We were not the first, and answering is how they find you. I want to say I phased out like a coward, but it wasn't that. It was a multiplication of attention I couldn't afford. Half of me stood in the room hearing the hum enter the concrete. Half of me was in Antarctica again with a drone lowering into a mouth. Half of me was inside a room where drones are the wrong shape of question. There are not that many halves in a person. They were going to break me into enough pieces that something could listen through me. I pulled the power on my laptop. I unplugged the Ring's feed from the decoder because my hands still listened to me. The room wobbled the way a city does when a subway passes under a place no one realized had rails. The monitors turned ordinary. The hum wrapped itself small and hid. We told ourselves after that we'd shut it down, that we'd preserved the discipline of not answering. I know better. The method itself is an answer. A mirror is an answer. Attention is an answer. We had poured shape into a room that a thing had been waiting a long time to occupy. The Ring was now an address. We left in ones and twos like a party that had discovered the host's secret. Outside the facility, the desert was the desert, the one honest thing in 100 miles. Above us, the sky had returned to its programmable emptiness. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel and tried, for 30 seconds, to return to the person who believed input and output were different. The next days were a choreography of pretend. Press releases about Atlas described probability cones and the reassuring history of missed appointments. The James Webb Telescope Discovery feed rotated to a new exoplanet candidate with a charming ring, and somewhere beneath old ice that knows how to keep things. Brine cooled around drowned geometry, but threads still listened. In our lab, the drift never resumed its original quiet mischief. It remained high, tense, a held breath. Small things began to notice. The atomic clock in our lobby, that handsome display case you put near the coffee machine to impress visitors, gained a twitch. Phones misread calendar invites as though refusing to attend certain times. A graduate student's pacemaker delivered a double tap once an hour on the hour in a rhythm that matched nothing the cardiologist could explain. People called it stress. We added a column to our spreadsheet called non-technical anomalies and laughed at ourselves for being human. At the margin of all this, a new track appeared in Thread's visualization, faint, like a bruise you don't remember earning. The lattice grew sideways. Something like a second voice began to speak in counterpoint to the first. It didn't braid, it interleaved. If the first chord had said, "We see you counting," the second said, "We see you being counted." On the morning the Atlas corridor collapsed toward us like a grin, my old Antarctic roommate sent me one photo. It was not an image. It was a scan of a paper document printed on a typewriter you could smell. The header was civilian, the footer military. The content was a transcript of a transmission received by an oceanographic cable station in 1974, back when Planet X wasn't even a rumor and people thought their televisions would always look like furniture. The transcript consisted of a sequence of numbers that mapped onto star positions not known in 1974, and then a short text in a language no one admitted the station could recognize. The translation had a note. Structure suggests instruction. Recommend test with passive reflection to avoid active call. At the bottom, penned by a human being who had to decide whether they were insane. When answered, questions become coordinates. I threw up in the lab sink. I remember the taste, because it smelled like the ring had when it bled. I took a leave. That is the phrase they put in HR. I drove north to a cabin my father once owned when he briefly believed in restful weekends. In the morning, over coffee, I opened the laptop I should have smashed and watched the drift render in the stale air like I had invited weather inside. At noon, the desert facility's telemetry appeared in my inbox as an encrypted attachment I didn't have the password for. I did not need the password. The file opened because the thing that had learned to lean liked that doors behaved like doors you could ask to be doors. I sat alone and listened to a cord fold. They didn't deflect Atlas. They didn't need to. Atlas adjusted its course like a person stepping around a puddle that wasn't there. We had been holding our breath for a rock. The cord was telling us that the rock was a question and that someone had answered near us. The story the cord told me then is the one that keeps my hands cold even now. Planet X is not a planet. It is the name stamped on an archive inside an object that looks like a planet when you are weak at seeing. The archive is a shelter built by something that remembers the taste of suns. It is full of questions. When a species learns how to hear its own time with sufficient tenderness, the shelter notices. It is drawn to the tenderness, the way bees are drawn to flowers they can see in colors we cannot name. We call it a rogue. It is following a scent. It asks you to mirror it. If you mirror it well enough, it answers. Its answers are coordinates. Not for you, for the thing that wants to feed. In Antarctica, we opened a door that wasn't ours. Under the ocean, in 1974, we were given a set of numbers and a gentle warning. In Nevada, we held up a mirror because we wanted proof more than we wanted to remain alive and uninteresting. In Pasadena, we listened with enough care to be delicious. The stream changed after Atlas stepped aside. It grew less like a choir and more like weather again, scattershot, sibilant like rain through wire. The second voice gained amplitude. And then, in a passage so plain I felt like insulting myself for believing it, the lattice wrote the only sentence I trust. Don't answer in a language you invented to feel alone. I closed the laptop. Not dramatically, carefully. The way you close a mouth that has said something you don't deserve to hear. I drove to town and sat in a library where the books made me feel heavy. I thought about my father's voice on late drives. I thought about the way clocks reassure children. I thought about how the first time I saw the ring, I wanted to kneel down because it was beautiful. Beauty is the most dangerous carrier wave. When I returned to the cabin, my phone had learned to vibrate in a pattern that sounded like my name. Nothing else had changed. The windows reflected a stranger who had finally decided that being small is another word for being out of range. I packed. I left Thread. I left the facility. I let other people write the reports that would pile up, unread, in rooms where flags and seals keep time. I have given you this because you asked me why I left, but also because the news cycle is unfaithful, and tomorrow there will be another James Webb Telescope discovery, and a new asteroid Atlas impact risk, and another billion little mirrors held up to hungry things. I can't tell you not to look. Looking is how we were made noble. I can tell you this. When you find a chord under the noise and it feels like your name, do not be flattered. Do not answer in a language you invented to feel alone. Do not build a mirror when what you need is a blindfold and the courage to sit while weather passes. There is one last thing I cannot prove. When I lay awake in the cabin listening to the ring that was no longer anywhere near me, I heard, buried in the undertone that had first said my name, another name. Not a person's, not a word. It was the sound a map makes when it folds around a city to keep it safe. It was a direction given in mercy. I don't know if we deserve mercy. I want to. I don't know if mercy is an equation or the moment when a predator decides to sleep. You asked me what the signal from Planet X really was. It wasn't physics, even when it moved our clocks and made instruments pray. It was a warning placed there by something that survived long enough to pity us, and it has only one clause. When answered, questions become coordinates. When coordinates exist, something comes. And what comes is older than our need to understand. I'm telling you this in a kitchen because kitchens are where truth tastes right. It is late. The house is quiet. In another universe, we are brave differently. In this one, bravery looks like letting go of a beautiful instrument and opening your hands. If, one night soon, you hear the hum under the refrigerator sound like syllables, do not be curious. Think of ice and doors drowned with kind hands. Remember that the first language the universe ever spoke was not light. It was silence measured between beats. Listen to me. The true message was never hello. It was the pause. And inside that pause, if you lean too hard, you will hear what I still hear when I try to sleep. A voice like the underside of a star whispering the only safe instruction we will ever be given. Stay unlocated.